The Seahawks look to be closing in on a favorite for their offensive coordinator vacancy, but is the job Klint Kubiak's to lose, or is another candidate still very much in the driver's seat? Going to be breaking it all down here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in, whether you're tuning in from Union Gap, Washington, or if you are over in Palm Beach, Florida. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Seahawks officially have their first candidate for their offensive coordinator position that is going to meet for the team with a second interview. Going to be breaking down whether that makes Klint Kubiak the favorite for the job, plus going to be taking a closer look at which assistants could come to the Seahawks, depending on who they end up hiring to replace Ryan Grubb, and a first look at 2025 opponents, next year's schedule. That's all coming up here on this latest installment of Locked On Seahawks that's brought your way by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedInNFL and use the code all lowercase LockedInNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Now for your lead story here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It was only just Monday that Klint Kubiak, who was the Saints offensive coordinator last season, spoke with the Seahawks for the first time for their vacancy for their offensive coordinator position. And in a matter of days, according to Ian Rappaport, NFL Network, the two sides are going to meet again, this time in person. Klint Kubiak set to meet with Mike Macdonald, John Schneider, and the rest of Seattle's decision makers as they try to zero in on who is going to replace Ryan Grubb. And some have wondered, what does this mean for the other candidates that have interviewed with the Seahawks? I'll get to more of that here in a moment. But the real question now is, with Kubiak this quickly getting a second interview, is he now the front runner for this offensive coordinator job? And I would say yes, there is a caveat to this, but I would say yes right now that he is in the driver's seat. I do think that there is another coach that is very much still in the passenger seat, and he's a big dude. So he's a chance to push Klint Kubiak out of the car if he wants to. I'll get to more of that in a moment, but I want to break down why Klint Kubiak is the favorite right now for this coaching position. When the Seahawks have reportedly interviewed 3 different coaches, it remains to be seen if they've interviewed the fourth candidate they put a request in, but we know for a fact that they have interviewed 3 different coordinator candidates. There may be more that have not gone public. That happens every year, even in today's era where it's really difficult to sneak that information. There are times that we end up hearing about candidates that interviewed well after they met with the team. Nonetheless, Kubiak's the first one reported to have a second interview with the Seahawks. And as I talked about when we first looked at candidates, before any of these interviews came out publicly, Klint Kubiak was a name that I threw out there as one of intrigue because of his background coming from Kyle Shanahan's offense, or you could even say from the Mike Shanahan system. His father, where Gary Kubiak, Klint Kubiak's father, was a backup quarterback for John Elway, and he ended up being a Super Bowl winning coach for the Denver Broncos. His system very much the same from what he learned from Mike Shanahan, and then Kyle Shanahan was the head coach when Klint Kubiak was the pass game coordinator in San Francisco 2 years ago. So there's all kinds of ties to that Shanahan-Kubiak scheme. Obviously, for Klint Kubiak, he's done a really good job with quarterbacks for the most part. Some people will point to Russell Wilson the second part of the 2022 season when Kubiak was given the play calling duties late in the year following Nathaniel Hackett's departure. Look, that was a mess. That entire season was a mess for the Denver Broncos. Not going to put too much on the interim play caller in that case. But you look at the other 2 times that Kubiak's been an offensive coordinator. Kirk Cousins threw 33 touchdown passes, the 9th most in the NFL in 2021. 2 years before that, he threw 35 when Kubiak was his quarterback coach. And then 2 years ago in San Francisco, Brock Purdy throws 31 touchdown passes, leads the league in yards per attempt. Obviously, Kyle Shanahan's offense, you got to give the credit to the head coach, but the passing game coordinator was just as integral in getting Brock Purdy to play at that level. So he's got a really good track record when it comes to working with quarterbacks. But this is what I think has really caught Mike Macdonald's attention, especially with some of the, I don't even want to say the word complaint, but some of the gripes that he had with the way the offense executed last year and not having complementary football, not having the physical football that he's looking for. If you look at the 2024 personnel usage for the New Orleans Saints last season, they ranked 29th in 11 personnel usage. That's one tight end and one running back. So they only use that 33% of the time. But this is what Mike Macdonald probably zeroed in and caught his attention on. 12 personnel, multiple tight ends, one running back, 30% of the time. That's sixth highest rate in the league. Detroit and Baltimore were just ahead of the New Orleans Saints in that category. 13 personnel with three tight ends, 8.3% of the time. That ranked fourth highest. And then 21 personnel with two backs on the field and one tight end. The Saints used that 16% of the time, and that was fourth. And guess which other two teams were right in the mix there? The Baltimore Ravens and the Detroit Lions. That is what is jumping out to Mike Macdonald and John Schneider, I think, is those offensive coordinator personnel tendencies. When you look at Klint Kubiak's past, 2021 with Minnesota, very similar in terms of having a wide variety of personnel groupings that he used, plenty of two-back, plenty of multi-tight end, three tight end looks. I think Mike Macdonald wants to get back to that style of football instead of having everything spread out, being shotgun all the time. I think he wants to get his quarterback under center. He wants to have that physical ground game. And even if it's just mostly zone blocking, I mean, the Baltimore Ravens, Detroit Lions, a lot of those teams run a lot of zone schemes. You can still be very physical running zone concepts. There's been plenty of times that the San Francisco 49ers have had a lot of success with that, with their offensive line moving people, displacing them vertically. So you still got to be physical. Klint Kubiak's personnel usage and the track record with quarterbacks, the systems that he has learned under, I mean, he's 37. He's been in the league, though, for 11 years, and he's worked for a number of coaches. He's been around a number of different philosophies. I just think all those things added together, he was going to be a coach that stood out to Mike Macdonald, and I thought he was going to be one that was a top candidate. With that being said, as I mentioned earlier, I do think there's a caveat to this. When you're saying he's the favorite, he absolutely is. But I've talked to multiple sources in the last 24 hours that indicated that Hank Fraley is still very much a person of high interest for the Seahawks when it comes to this offensive coordinator position. They met with him last Friday virtually. That was per league rules. You couldn't do in-person interviews with teams, their coaches that were still in the playoffs, but they were able to talk to him virtually last Friday. And the interview went really well from my understanding. The issue that the Seahawks are now dealing with, and any team that wants to hire a coach off of Dan Campbell's staff, the rules have changed a lot this year. The league was trying to make it that there wasn't such a flurry right at the end of the season, and so many of these teams in the playoffs were potentially losing coaches. They were losing time to prepare for games. They altered the schedule quite a bit. And so with that, when you're looking at Hank Fraley, the situation the Seahawks are dealing with, they were able to get that interview virtually done in that window from January 6th to January 12th. Now, because Detroit is still in the playoffs, they had the number one seed, they had the bye week, no interviews from January 13th till at least January 19th. If the Lions lose this weekend, January 20th, the window opens for in-person interviews with coaches from those losing teams. So Hank Fraley, if the Lions lose this weekend, would be available to talk to and set up an interview if he wants to do so. And that's not just with the Seahawks. If the Lions win that game, however, there isn't another window until the 27th, which is the bye week in between the championship games and the Super Bowl. And that would still be virtually if the Lions win that game in the NFC Championship to advance to the Super Bowl. If they lose, you can set up some in-person interviews. And if Detroit's in the Super Bowl and you don't get that interview done during that bye week before the Super Bowl from February 2nd to February 9th, there's no access to coaches from the Super Bowl teams. And so that has made this kind of a, I don't want to say a muddy situation, but it complicates things a little bit because Mike Macdonald wants to have a balanced approach here. He wants to make sure that Seattle gets the best candidate they can. He wants to get the best offensive coordinator to fit what he's looking for. But you also don't want to risk potentially losing somebody like a Klint Kubiak. If they are that interested in Klint Kubiak, do you want to wait this process out when there is the possibility that Hank Fraley could end up going with Ben Johnson, the Lions offensive coordinator, somewhere else if he gets a head coaching job, or Aaron Glenn, the defensive coordinator? He's interviewed with a bunch of teams. Either one of those guys could plug Hank Fraley in as their offensive coordinator, and there may be other teams that are interested in Fraley as well. So you're running the risk if you wait that out. You don't know if you're going to necessarily get him as your offensive coordinator. So there's a lot of variables to consider here, but I would say right now that those are the two candidates that very much are head and shoulders above everybody else. They are very intrigued by Klint Kubiak, but there's also a lot of interest in Hank Fraley. And keeping that in mind, when I come back, these offensive coordinator candidates, there's a lot of wrinkles. Once the candidate is hired for the position, then you got to start building a staff. I'm going to take a look at some assistant coaches who could follow Kubiak or Hank Fraley to Seattle and join their staff in the Pacific Northwest. We'll get to that coming up next year on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. When you get that hunch during the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You can bet on everything from Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen combining for 6 or more total touchdowns to Jahmyr Gibbs producing 115 total yards from scrimmage in NFL divisional weekend. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in. And thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. And for your second listen, make sure to check out the new and improved Locked On NFL. It's now twice a day in the morning. Tyler Rowland of Locked On Titans dishing out the morning cup of NFL Espresso. And then Tony Wiggins of Locked On Jaguars bringing the humor and analysis you won't find anywhere else with episode number 2. Again, Locked On NFL now twice a day on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Make it your second listen after Locked On Seahawks. Continuing to discuss Seattle's vacancy for the offensive coordinator position. As I just mentioned, Klint Kubiak is the favorite in my opinion, although I think Hank Fraley is still very much in the mix. There may be another coordinator that emerges here for the Seahawks as they look for a replacement for Ryan Grubb at the play caller position. But right now, Kubiak and Hank Fraley, those two look to be the ones that are very much in the mix here for the Seahawks to get that job. And when the hiring is made, whether it's Kubiak or it's Fraley, and let's just say that those are the two right now that it's down to, maybe there's another coach that emerges at some point. But if those are truly the two favorites to replace Ryan Grubb, whoever gets hired is going to have to build an offensive coaching staff. And maybe Mike Macdonald will come to an agreement on a few of the guys that are currently on staff. Maybe somebody like a Jake Peets, who was the pass game coordinator. Maybe he stays on board with the Seahawks staff. He does have some connections to a few coaches that the Seahawks have talked to. He's been around the league. He's been in college as well. But most likely, if you've seen the news out there, coaches like Charles London, their quarterback coach, he interviewed for the Browns offensive coordinator position. And you also had a couple of other assistants that have already departed for different jobs. Zach Hill went back to Boise State after being an assistant on the offensive side of the ball. And that's because typically when there's a new coordinator hired, he's going to want to bring in his own coaches, or at least most of the offensive staff in this case will be dictated by who Klint Kubiak or Hank Fraley wants in those various positions. So keeping that in mind, I've gotten tons of questions the last few days about potential assistants that could be paired with these two guys if they were hired as offensive coordinator. And I think they are great questions. In fact, I've done a lot of research. I've done calling around. There's a number of names that I've been hinted at could potentially be on the Seahawks staff, depending on who's hired. Let's start with the one that's got 2 interviews lined up in Klint Kubiak. And he's been around. Like I said, he's only 37 years old. He's barely older than Mike Macdonald is. He's still a very young coach, but he's been in the league for 11 years, and he had a couple college stops sprinkled in between. But he basically got done with his college career as a safety at Colorado State, and went right into the coaching business like his father did. He's been with the Broncos. He's been with the Vikings, 49ers, most recently the Saints. He's had a couple different stints in Minnesota and in Denver. He has coached with a number of different staffs. So he's got a lot of connections. When you look at some of the coaches that were on the Saints staff this year, there are 4 of them that jump out to me. And the one that I want to talk about first, Rick Dennison, who has been in the league for a long time. He worked for Gary Kubiak in Denver. He's been in the Shanahan staff previously as well. He was just a senior assistant this season, but he's been a run game coordinator. He's been an offensive line coach. He has had a number of different hats in his career. I think Dennison is a coach that could very well be that elder statesman that joins this staff with Klint Kubiak, since he was just with him in New Orleans. I think he still wants to be involved with coaching, maybe not to the capacity that he was when he was younger, but I think he still wants to be involved. Dennison would be an excellent asset for the entire coaching staff to have around, because I feel like they didn't have enough seasoned, experienced coaches on this staff last year. Rick Dennison has been around. He's been on 3 Super Bowl champion teams, the staff for those teams. So you're talking about a decorated coach that I think would be an excellent addition. And I've been told there is a good chance that Klint Kubiak, wherever he ends up, Dennison could be talked into coaching for that team that he goes to. A couple other Saints assistants worth mentioning here. John Benton has been in the league a long time as well, almost as long as Rick Dennison has been an O-line coach for a number of years. He was with the 49ers from 2017 to 2020, so he was the offensive line coach for one of their Super Bowl teams during that time. He has an outstanding reputation. They had a ton of injuries in that Saints offensive line last year, and they still finished 14th in rushing. So I think John Benton is a guy that would make a lot of sense replacing Scott Huff. I find it hard to envision that Scott Huff is going to stay on staff with either one of these coaches if they get hired. In fact, I'd be surprised if he is on the staff at all with them hiring a new offensive coordinator. We'll have to wait and see. But John Benton would be a coach that went to New Orleans with Klint Kubiak. They've got some linkage with some of their coaching ties, having worked for the Shanahans in different time periods, but they've worked in the same system. Benton is a coach that makes a lot of sense. And 2 other assistants on New Orleans staff worth mentioning. Andrew Janocko, their quarterback coach. He was previously with the Minnesota Vikings during the time that Kubiak was on the Vikings staff from 2019 to 2021. Before he went to Chicago briefly, and then he was with the Saints this year. And Keith Williams, he was the Ravens receivers coach for a couple years, and he helped develop Zay Flowers as a rookie. This year, he was the Saints receiver coach. Considering all the injuries they had, he did a decent job preparing 4th and 5th stringers to be productive in the second half of the season. Those are 4 coaches from the New Orleans tree that make sense. And then when you look at the fact that Kubiak coached in San Francisco 2 years ago, and he's coached with Kyle Shanahan. Oh, by the way, his brother is on the 49ers staff. I have to include Klint Kubiak on here. He is the pass game specialist for San Francisco. Now, I don't know what position could be offered where the Seahawks could get permission for him to be offered an interview. If they offered him a pass game coordinator, I think it's the same thing. So I don't know that the Seahawks would have the flexibility there, but at least got to include his name on there. And Deuce Schwartz, who is San Francisco's offensive quality control coach, has only been with the team for a couple of years, but he was there in the 2023 season when Klint Kubiak was there. Schwartz could be somebody that can jump up to pass game coordinator now with the experience as a quality control coach in San Francisco. And he's viewed as a coach, based on my discussions, that has a really bright future and is expected to climb that ladder quickly. Why not look at him right now? As for the other candidate in the ring, Hank Fraley, had a little tougher time with the discussions that I've had reaching out with people, trying to figure out who around the league that he is courting as a potential pass game coordinator outside of Detroit. It's a little different than Kubiak, where you already had those building connections coaching on other teams. Fraley has been with the Lions since 2016 when he came over from Minnesota. There's not a lot of coaching ties to that Viking staff that are necessarily going to fit with this coaching search in terms of adding assistants to the staff. But when you look at some coaches that could come to Seattle with Hank Fraley as part of a tag team, Steve Oliver would be the first one I would mention. Now, Dan Campbell could very easily turn to Steve Oliver if Fraley leaves and say, hey, you are now the O-line coach for this football team. So Oliver could easily stay in Detroit. But if Fraley is the offensive coordinator, he could tell Steve Oliver, hey, you're the offensive line coach in Seattle. Come with me, and we can open up the opportunity. Maybe you can become an offensive coordinator down the line. The one that I've heard the most buzz about, however, has been Antoine Randell and he's the receivers coach. And for Seahawks fans who have been following this team for a long time, that might not be a name that you're necessarily excited about because of Super Bowl 40. He was the receiver for the Steelers that threw a long touchdown pass on a trick play in that game. So there are a lot of Seahawks fans that naturally are not Antoine Randell fans, but he is a fantastic coach. He is a high IQ football guy. He was a quarterback in college at Indiana. That's why he was the right candidate to have to throw trick plays and stuff, because he had a really good arm, could throw the football. But you look at Detroit's receivers and how players like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, there's a number of other guys on that roster that have improved dramatically with Randell as their receivers coach. And with that quarterback background, I think he's ready to be a pass game coordinator. My understanding is that he is one of the candidates that Hank Fraley would like to bring with him if he ends up in Seattle or with another team as an offensive coordinator. He is going to need a passing game coordinator because he is mostly a run game guy, being an offensive lineman previously in the NFL. He needs that pass game mindset. Antoine Randell is a coach that I think very much could fit that bill. And from my understanding, that might be your favorite to be the pass game coordinator with Hank Fraley, and a couple other assistants on the line staff to keep an eye on. Seth Ryan is their assistant receivers coach that works with Antoine Randell. Don't know if he's necessarily ready to be a pass game coordinator, but he could be a candidate potentially for this position, or even just being the receiver coach, which is a jump for being an assistant. And then former Ohio State and NFL quarterback JT Barrett, has not been that long ago that he was in the league. He is the assistant quarterback coach for the Lions, and he is a quickly rising coaching prospect on that staff. You could offer him the quarterback coaching job to go with Hank Fraley, and I don't think anybody would bat an eye. That is how much of a reputation that this young man is already building up. So JT Barrett would be a wild card that I would watch as well. But both these coaches, Klint Kubiak and Hank Fraley, they've got a lot of connections on their current staffs. They've got connections outside of the building. Fraley was tougher to really put a finger on that, but there definitely are some coaches around the league that he has had some discussions with about potentially joining his staff. And so it's going to be interesting as more as those details come out. But there's certainly some candidates on Detroit's own coaching staff that he could bring with him potentially in promoted positions on a staff in Seattle, or if he becomes an offensive coordinator with Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn. You might have several of these coaches end up building their own staff on whatever team that those coaches end up with. Coming up next, going to take a break from all the coordinator discussion. We now know all of Seattle's opponents for the 2025 season, and waited a week on this because now we have some interesting tidbits on a couple of potential international games the Seahawks could play next year. Going to be looking at those upcoming opponents and just some insight on the upcoming schedule that'll be coming up next year on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find subscriptions that you'd forgot about or thought you were paying for twice? That has definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions I didn't even realize that I was still paying for. Tells you how much I'm looking at my bank statements. Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down, and it's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place. Whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year, Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, the best feature is the subscription tracker. I've used it to cancel services I wasn't using anymore. I was paying for Disney Plus twice, for example, so I was able to take care of that issue to save myself some money. I've been able to automatically set aside money for my future. No more stressing about budgeting every month. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals today with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/locked-on. That's rocketmoney.com/locked-on. rocketmoney.com/locked-on. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in, and thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Shifting away from the coordinator talk for just a few moments, obviously that is the number one news story right now going on revolving around the Seahawks, trying to find a replacement for Ryan Grubb. But with the regular season ending, a little over a week ago, we now know all of Seattle's upcoming opponents for the 2025 season. And in the last few days, there's been a few more nuggets that have been released by the NFL. We know which teams are going to be hosting a number of the international games next year. And for those of you that have interest in those, I know there's a lot of fans that don't like those games because they take away games in the United States. Those of you that were hoping to see Seahawks Steelers in Pittsburgh, there's a chance you might not be able to see that game in Pittsburgh this year. But looking at those upcoming opponents for the Seahawks, obviously, like every year, you've got your 6 games against NFC West rivals, the 49ers, Cardinals, and Rams. On the home docket, since the Vikings finished second in their division, the Seahawks will host the Vikings at Lumen Field for a second straight year. They've got the AFC South next season, so the Colts and Texans will be the 2 teams coming to the Pacific Northwest. And then they're also playing the NFC South, the Buccaneers and the Saints, the 2 teams that are going to be coming to Lumen Field. On the away side of things, Panthers and Falcons got road trips to Carolina and Atlanta. Also have to travel to Nashville and Jacksonville, as well as Washington and Pittsburgh. That means you've got 5 games that are going to be Eastern time zone games. But if you're looking for maybe a silver lining on that, there are a couple games worth noting here. The Jacksonville Jaguars and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Those 2 teams are road games for the Seahawks next year. The Jaguars are going to play one of their home games in London, and the Steelers, they are going to get one of the other home games. This one is going to be in Dublin, Ireland, the first time that a game is played in Ireland. So the Seahawks could potentially play either one of those games. I want to make this clear that it won't be both. It would be one or the other. And obviously, the Steelers and the Jaguars have 9 home games this year. So that means there's 9 different teams that could be picked from. But there are some dynamics here that make it, especially the Steelers game. Steelers-Seahawks could potentially end up being in Dublin. When you look at some of the scheduling for other teams in other sports in those cities, it makes sense. Week 4, potentially, that's the one that I saw, week 4, that the Mariners and Pirates, they're both playing at home during baseball season. That might be a time that you can sprinkle in Steelers Seahawks in Dublin, Ireland. So if you're somebody that lives in Ireland or you can make it to Ireland and you'd like to see the Seahawks play an international game, that could happen. The Jaguars in London is also a slim possibility. But at least until the schedule comes out in May, we have an opportunity to at least wonder if the Seahawks might have an international game for the first time since they played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Germany in 2022. As far as the games that interest me the most on the schedule, I'm going to not look at the NFC West games for now because those games are always the most important. But I'm intrigued by several games on both the home and away side of things. The home game, Minnesota, I expect to see J.J. McCarthy as the starting quarterback next year, not Sam Darnold. So you're going to have that wrinkle going against the former first-round pick. We'll see what the Saints look like. They could have a different quarterback under center. They're going to have a different coaching staff. And then the Colts and Texans, 2 of the top 5 picks of the quarterback position from a few years ago, Anthony Richardson and C.J. Stroud. One has obviously been much more successful so far, but 2 talented young quarterbacks that will be taking their teams to the Pacific Northwest. And on the away side of things, look, I'm saying it right now. The Carolina Panthers could be a dangerous team next year. If you were watching Dave Canales, the former Seahawks assistant, who is now the head coach there in Carolina, if you were watching those Panthers the last 6 or 7 weeks of the season, this was a different football team, and it started the quarterback spot. How much confidence makes a difference? Bryce Young got benched for Andy Dalton early in the season. Last 7 weeks, according to Pro Football Focus, no quarterback had more big-time throws than Bryce Young. He looked like the number 1 overall pick that a lot of people thought he was going to be. They've got some intriguing pieces. They've got a number of draft picks. Carolina's got a chance to get that roster bolstered enough that they can be a threat in the NFC South. And Seattle's got to travel all the way to the East Coast to play in Charlotte. That is going to be a difficult game. And from an intrigue standpoint, the Tennessee Titans, that might be where Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward is drafted number 1 overall, a new quarterback in Tennessee, especially if Sanders gets picked there. Obviously, that name draws a lot of fanfare, a lot of excitement. So that game has more intrigue than you would expect for a team that finished with the number 1 overall pick with a dreadful first season under a new coaching staff. But that is a game that I'm excited about. And then the Commanders, if Bobby Wagner's back, and of course, Jaden Daniels, what a sensation he's been this year. Seattle's got to go all the way cross country to play in that game on the road against one of the emerging powers in the NFC in Washington. So there's some games in this schedule that if you would have looked at it, a year ago, you would have said this looks really easy. But there are a lot of games that I think there's some teams here. Maybe they didn't finish well this year that have a chance to be much improved. And then you've got rising powers like Washington. A lot of really exciting games. And if there's a silver lining here, the Seahawks were almost unbeaten on the road. If they can continue that next season, having 9 road games, that might be what gets them into the postseason, especially with a road trip potentially in either Ireland or in London. So we'll have to see what happens. But I think there's a number of matchups on that schedule that are going to be really fun once we get through free agency and the draft. We'll revisit all these matchups because a lot of these teams, they're going to change a lot between the end of the Super Bowl and the start of OTAs and offseason programs. We'll have a little better idea of what these teams are going to look like. But certainly expect some of these teams to be much improved. Some of the playoff teams might take a step back. We'll have to wait and see what happens personnel-wise, but plenty of games to be excited about and the potential for an international game in 2025. As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. I'll be joined by my co-host Nick Lee tomorrow for our latest Blue Friday installment, and we'll be talking some potential free agents to watch from the NFC and AFC divisional round games and more. Make sure that you're listening and enjoy the rest of your Thursday night. Go Hawks.